I am Laura Dixon, and you are listening to the Naturally Thin for Life podcast, episode number 202, Positive Motivation. Welcome to the Naturally Thin for Life podcast. Get ready to learn how to live in your dream body, free from all the diet rules. You're going to learn the naturally thin mindset and strategies so that you never need to count, track, or measure your food ever again. And instead, you get to live the rest of your life at your body's optimal weight with the peace and freedom you've been craving. Let's dive in. Hey friends, let's talk about some motivation today. Motivation to making naturally thin food choices, motivation to reaching your goal weight. Someone recently asked me inside of the Naturally Thin for Life membership on a coaching call, something along the lines of, how do I get the positive motivation to not want to eat the food that doesn't serve me? And sometimes someone will ask me, how do I get motivated to want to exercise? Or how do I motivate myself to not go back for seconds when I'm not hungry at dinner? Or how do I get motivated to just have 3 squares of chocolate instead of 2 bars? And I told the woman I was coaching and everyone else listening that I actually think this is the wrong type of question to be asking yourself. And today's podcast is going to explain why and what to do instead. I told her, I think actually a better question to ask yourself, a more productive question, is how do I simply become more willing to allow my brain's extra desire for this chocolate right now and simultaneously not answer that call so that I can instead honor my body. And this means you hold kind of 2 truths at the same time. Think of holding both of these truths in the palm of your hand. Each one gets one of your palms. So on one side, on one palm, you have the vibration in your body that feels like that urge or that desire to eat, right? And your brain is like, I want that, I want that, I want that. And your body is vibrating to match what your brain is saying, which is a quote unquote truth because it's actually happening in your body, right? That emotion is real. You don't want to deny that. And I think sometimes we say to ourselves, well, I just want positive motivation so that I don't have to acknowledge that vibration in my body so that I can make that vibration go away. But a lot of times it's not going to go away until you learn this skill. And so when you think about that being in one palm of your hand, that vibration, that urge, that desire in your body, and really it's your brain's desire for extra chocolate. It's not your body's desire. And then on the other palm, on the other side, is your decision to not answer that vibration. Because in this other palm, what's even stronger is your desire to feel really good. So they're both desires, the desire to eat extra chocolate and the desire to feel really good. And in this example that when you eat a whole nother bar of chocolate, you're not going to feel really good. So you're simultaneously holding both of these truths. Your temporary desire to eat chocolate, even though you're not going to feel that great, but your brain's like, I want it, I want it, I want it. And then also in the other side, in the other palm of your hand, the desire to feel really good and to not answer your brain's desire to eat more chocolate. So you find yourself sitting there having that desire and that urge to eat the food and the desire to not eat it at the same time. It's really important that you recognize this first and that you hold them both and you see that they're both desires that you have. Because your desire, and I think sort of the genesis of this question leads to this, is the desire to not want it can only become stronger when you recognize that it exists in the first place, right? When it gets the opportunity to be answered. And so if you keep giving in to your brain's desire to eat the chocolate, to eat the second servings, to eat in a way that's not serving your body, and you never recognize that you actually have the desire to feel good, you actually have the desire to not eat more chocolate, then that desire never gets the opportunity to become stronger. So I think a lot of times we want to just jump to that being the case, where we never ever want the extra chocolate and we only ever have the desire to feel really good. But I don't really ever see it happening that way. Usually it happens where you have both desires at the same time. You recognize them both. You hold them in each palm of your hand, and then you become more skilled. You strengthen your muscle of answering the desire to feel good in your body, which means saying no to the chocolate. And ironically, the more you embrace your willingness to feel this temporary discomfort, and the discomfort is just kind of noticing and experiencing, right, that urge, that desire to eat, but yet the desire to feel really good. And kind of it's like that back and forth where those desires in your next action steps aren't necessarily aligned because one is eating the chocolate, one is not. And so that temporary discomfort in your mind and your body, the more willing you are to embrace that and not answer your brain's desire to eat the extra chocolate, and instead listen to your body and your actual kind of stronger desire to feel really good, the easier and easier it gets, and the more positive motivation kind of just inherently happens without you needing to do anything, because you've strengthened the muscle of listening to your body, of honoring your body. And then you get the immediate gratification of feeling really good physically because you didn't just eat an extra bar of chocolate. And then you don't just feel good physically now, but you may feel good physically for potentially the next several hours, right? Depending on your food choices. And you don't just feel good because you didn't eat something and feel that way physically, but you also get to feel really great emotionally. You get to feel proud of yourself. You get to feel the lack of regret or guilt or shame of eating in a way that wasn't serving your body. So it's not just the physical benefit you get, that physical immediate gratification of not eating extra food or deciding not to eat when you aren't hungry, but you also get the emotional benefit when you hold both truths in the palm of your hand and you decide to make a decision that's aligned with your naturally thin self. You get that sense of just like pride and accomplishment. And then, like I was saying, that muscle gets stronger and stronger, and that just becomes your more habitual way of thinking. And I think a lot of us don't realize that we can hold both at the same time and decide which one we want to do. It's no different than a lot of other decisions we make. But I think so often we think, well, but I want it, I deserve it. That just becomes our habit thinking and our habit action that we start to take. And we don't realize that we can hold both truths in the palms of our hand. And I think of this after effect, kind of like the reward of it getting easier and easier, the more willing you are to embrace that temporary kind of discomfort of two truths that don't lead to the same action, and deciding to make a change and take an action that maybe is not your habitual way of acting by leaning into and recognizing your desire to feel really good, is the reward of this end product of intrinsic motivation to honor your body, right? It's like the payoff. It's like you put in the emotional work, you put in the mental work, right? Of that temporary discomfort, of that willingness. And your payoff is that it gets easier and easier. The payoff is that you first embrace that temporary unsettled feeling in your body of holding the truths at the same time, and then actually deciding which one to honor. Instead of, so often I think we tell ourselves that we had no choice in the matter. And in this, it's important to remember when you are holding these truths in your hands that you're embracing that mental discomfort very temporarily. The urge or the desire of your brain to eat in a way that your body doesn't actually want anything to do with. And what's on the other side of the decision is an opportunity to feel so incredible physically and emotionally better as well, because like I was saying before, you're not laced with the guilt and the regret and the shame, and instead you feel really proud that you honored your body. It's so temporary and it's so fleeting. And when you fail to recognize these two truths in the palm of your hand and you think instead you just need a bunch of like you rah-rah motivation, you miss out on the skill of strengthening your ability to make this decision. And you miss out on the opportunity of feeling really good and seeing what it's like to make a decision that's aligned with your naturally thin self. So I'm going to share with you some more tactics and strategies and kind of ways to embrace your willingness and to foster your willingness to do this for yourself. But it's really important that I just wanted to lay that foundation and kind of imagery that you can imagine holding those two truths in the palm of your hand, because Just because you have the urge or the desire to eat another bar of chocolate when you've already eaten some chocolate and you feel satisfied, just because that desire is there does not mean that your desire to feel good physically, your desire to not eat the chocolate is somehow missing. They're not mutually exclusive. They can both be there, and it's just very uncomfortable sometimes. And it can feel unsettling sometimes for our brain to hold to contradictory truths. So I looked up the definition of motivation, right? So many people we want to be more motivated. We want to be more motivated. And there were two definitions I really liked, and they were really just the first ones that also came up. One is that motivation is the reason or reasons one has for acting or behaving in a particular way. And the second definition is the general desire or willingness of someone to do something. And you'll notice in neither of these definitions, did it talk about being excited? Did it talk about being elated? Did it talk about being all jazzed up? Right? Our motivation is just why we do something, or our willingness to do something, and then our action to follow through on that willingness and actually do the thing. And sometimes I think we believe that motivation should always feel really hyped up and really good. And I don't think that's necessarily always the case. So I think instead we have to find ways to generate our own internal motivation. This is one of the reasons that I do not believe in external accountability groups, or I do not keep a accountability group inside of my Naturally Thin for Life membership, especially when it comes to our relationship with food. I think the only way to have freedom and peace in something as kind of personal and in something that we are going to relate to for the rest of our lives, being food and our bodies, that we have to find the ways that work for us to generate our own motivation to make choices that allow our bodies to feel really good and release excess weight. And so it's our own willingness to do something. And like I was saying, I think it's just a misconception that motivation falls upon us, like it just falls out of the sky and we just have it all of a sudden, or that it has to be this hyped up cheerleader energy. I have the willingness and the motivation to do many things that I don't actually really want to do in the moment. And so do you. So think about it right now. I will find and generate motivation for myself to maybe answer an email that simultaneously my brain is like, can we just do that later? I don't want to do it right now. I will find the motivation and the willingness to take a couple of hours and solve a really complicated problem. Even though my brain is like, can we do that later tomorrow? Do you have time tomorrow on your calendar? We should not do that right now, right? I will find time and motivation and willingness to review a slide deck or to make dinner. So just because you don't feel excited about it doesn't mean that you don't have positive motivation. I want to invite you to reframe positive motivation to just mean a willingness that's aligned with what you want in the future. That's all. It's just an action or a behavior with a reason that's in alignment with your naturally thin self in this case, when we're talking about food and losing weight, rather than some super jazzed up excitement. It's enough willingness, just enough. You only need enough. You don't need a ton of it, especially in the beginning. It's just enough. And enough willingness. You don't need a ton of it, but just enough willingness to think, feel, and act as your naturally thin self in this one moment. And I think it's important to also remember that there's a spectrum of motivation. There may be times where it's just almost like a mundane motivation. Right? Think about something simple like putting your seatbelt on in the car, or brushing your teeth, or washing your face at night, or changing your kid's diaper, or making dinner, right? You're not super jazzed up and motivated. It's more like a mundane kind of boring motivation. You're willing enough to take the action to have a baby that doesn't have a dirty diaper, right? Or you're willing enough to make dinner, even though there's part of you that doesn't really want to in that moment. And then there are also times where we do experience that jazzed up and very, very excited motivation. But it's important to remember that there is a spectrum. And I think the misconception is that we should always have that jazzed up, cheerleader, hyped up motivation in order to lose weight or in order to make a change. And I just don't think it's useful to think about it that way. And I also don't think it's realistic. So remember that when you're generating enough willingness to make a decision in alignment with your naturally thin self, I'm going to give you some things to consider and some tactics for you. And so first, simply remember that positive motivation is not that hyped up cheerleader energy. It's not being jazzed up. It's not being super excited. It's simply enough willingness to make a decision that's in alignment with your naturally thin self. And the other thing to remember as I go through some of these tactics is that it's important that you hold both truths. That desire to eat a bar of chocolate when you know you're not going to feel good, and the desire to not eat it so that you can feel good. And that may sometimes feel unsettling. It may sometimes feel temporarily uncomfortable. But if you don't start there and hold both truths in the palm of your hand, you miss the opportunity to strengthen your muscle, to strengthen the skill of listening to your body and feeling really physically good. So when you're you can think about, you've gotten to this place, you're recognizing you're holding both truths, you know you don't need the positive jazzed up motivation. Okay, how do you strengthen your willingness to follow through on your desire to feel good and follow through on your desire to not eat the chocolate? So some ways that you can do this is you can think about your future self, both in the short and long term. So in the short term, I mean like 5 minutes from now, 2 minutes from now, 90 seconds from now, like pretty short term, make it very short. And think about how you will feel in your body. Think about the immediate gratification you will get of feeling good. And often this is just an underutilized and underdeveloped skill and muscle in our own mind because we haven't done this. We're so used to just thinking about, but it'll taste good, but it'll taste good, it'll taste good, without ever giving like equal opportunity for your brain to imagine, but how will I feel? How will I feel incredible? How will I feel so proud of myself? So in that short term, when you're thinking about just 5 minutes from now or less, think about not just how you will feel physically and how you'll get that immediate gratification, the immediate reward of feeling good physically, but how you also get the short-term reward and what turns into a long-term reward because it compounds over time, but how you get that immediate gratification of the emotional pride, of the emotional accomplishment, how you then don't have to feel physically or drained or fatigued because you just overate. And when you remember that, again, it strengthens in that palm of your hand your desire to feel really good, both physically and emotionally. And then when you're holding both truths in the palm of your hand, you can think long term. What habit do you want to get stronger? I will often think about this for myself. I'm like, okay, sometimes, the decision we make in this moment, it's like, well, just this one time, I'm just going to have the chocolate and I will do this again tomorrow. And a lot of times thinking about your future self and the immediate gratification you get short term can kind of help you embrace your willingness to make a decision that's in alignment with your naturally thin self. But something that also often helps me is I will think about myself 6 months from now, a year from now, and I'll think, okay, what habit do I want to get stronger? And when I think about myself in the future, I'm like, oh, okay, this decision, like it seemingly doesn't matter, but also it does matter. Because what I choose now will be what gets stronger. It will be what gets easier. So it can either get easier for me to eat another bar of chocolate, or it can get easier for me to not eat that bar of chocolate and to feel really good physically, and to actually then reduce my desire to even want that bar of chocolate because I just love feeling so good. And so you want to think about when you're holding both truths in the palms of your hand, both yourself short-term, very short-term, and the immediate gratification you're going to get from choosing the decision that's in alignment with your naturally thin self, and also long-term what you're going to get. And think about how incredible is it going to be when you've practiced this over and over and over again, and 6 months from now, it's just not really something that's on your mind. How cool is that? And the other thing to remember when you're holding both truths in the palm of your hands is that you only need to move the needle slightly. You don't need that desire for the extra bar of chocolate to go away. You don't need to push it out of your brain. You don't need to reject it and hit the eject button, but you only need to move the needle slightly. And this is especially important if you lean maybe a little bit more negative. Think about the energy required to move your emotional state from frustrated, defeated, and hopeless to elated and excited, right? And especially if you find yourself in more frustration, in more anxiety, in more defeated feelings, and you aren't like naturally an elated and excited person, which is a little bit more how my tendency is as well. When you then expect yourself to be very positively motivated to ever make a change, but like your personality doesn't really lean that way to begin with, that's kind of like a lot of pressure and just not very realistic. And the amount of energy to go from defeated to elated is significant. And so you only need to move the needle slightly. It's like if you imagine, like a traditional scale with the two sides and the weights and they go up and down, right? And they have the bar in the middle. I don't remember exactly what you call it, but you imagine like that traditional scale with the two sides and your two palms in the hand. If they're both equal in the moment, and that's all you really need to do to then move the needle slightly. And by simply recognizing these two truths in the palm of your hand, remember the one is that you have the desire to eat the extra chocolate, or of course, fill in the blank, whatever the food is. And you also have the desire to feel really good. And not eating the chocolate is going to allow you to do that. Imagine they're both weighted equally. All you need to do is slightly tip the scales toward your desire to feel really good. And you can do that again by what I was sharing earlier about thinking about yourself short-term and long-term. And you can also tip the scales by thinking about when you are your naturally thin self. You can imagine, like, what is it like for me? What's that freedom like? What's that peace like? What is it like to feel physically incredible in my body more often than not? And that just being my baseline. And that again is going to your future self. And when you're doing this, it's important to remember that when you are naturally thin, you've reached your naturally thin weight, you've been there, let's say for 5 years, 10 years, that version of you, she's not relying on super positive, excited motivation. She still has stressful days. She still feels anxious. She still has whatever is causing you to overeat now. It will still be there in the future. And there isn't enough positive motivation in the world to make all of that, like, quote unquote, go away. And so when you remember, okay, in the future, I'm naturally thin. I don't have like a bunch of hyped up cheerleader, you rah rah energy to make my food decisions. That naturally thin version of you 5-10 years from now, or maybe even a year from now, or even like in a couple of months or not that far into the future, right? Her decisions around food are probably somewhat like boring and calm. They're not like super exciting all of the time. And I don't mean that to say your food tastes boring, but your food choices when you're naturally thin in the future, they don't have these big emotional ups and downs. They don't have like all of this excitement or all of this regret, right? It's just very like calm and even keeled because it's so habitual for you. And so learning this skill now of that being the case is really important. So when you're thinking about tipping the scales in the direction of, I want to feel physically good, I want this to be easier for me in the future, remember that your naturally thin self, a year, 5 years, whatever point in time you think about in the future, she's not relying on a bunch of excited, positive motivation. So it's really important to learn that skill now. Another thing to remember is that you do get positive motivation and a reward after you hold both truths in the palms of your hand or in your mind's eye, and you choose the one that's most aligned with the version of you, with you in the future and with your naturally thin self, right? There's that immediate gratification. And I think remembering the positive motivation is there. You do get the reward. It is there. It may not look like how we expect on the front end, but it can look even greater on the back end because you get such a sense of pride, such a sense of accomplishment. Such a sense of like just an internal, like, look at me, like, look how I am doing this. Look at how I am caring for myself and honoring my body. And now I get to feel physically great because I didn't just eat another bar of chocolate when I was already satisfied. And that positive motivation compounds. So like I was saying before, that spectrum, it's like you can take a lot of energy to go from defeated to elated. But your positive motivation, remember, all it needs to be is simply enough willingness to make a decision aligned with your naturally thin self. That's it. And as you do that, and as you practice that, that also is on a spectrum. And the positive motivation, enough willingness, becomes greater and greater and greater and greater the more you practice it. And so there's like an emotional lightness. There is a intrinsic, innate motivation to want to feel so good physically that does compound, and it will get to the point where it's so strong that for me now, the desire to eat pretty much any food that I know is not going to leave me feeling the way I want to feel, it's essentially gone. And I think we often want that right away in the beginning, but it doesn't work that way. It's kind of like you have to earn it by going through this process. And I think sometimes we also want a lot of positive motivation because we think it's going to be some like terrible process. We're going to have to use so much willpower. We're going to have to like sit on our hands and white knuckle our way through everything. But when you think about the approach I've outlined here, you aren't being harsh on yourself. You're not criticizing yourself. You're not berating yourself. You're not telling yourself you don't know what to do, that you should know better. You're not doing any of that. You're simply holding both truths in the palms of your hand, the desire to eat that extra bar of chocolate, even though you know that you're not going to feel the way you want to feel, even though you know it's not aligned with your naturally self, and simultaneously your desire to not eat that chocolate so that you can lose weight, but really more importantly, feel really good physically, feel really good emotionally. And when you recognize those and practice tipping the scale in the direction of your desire to feel really good physically, I think of it as kind of like you've earned the positive motivation that is just there all the time. All right, my friends, I hope that you found this episode helpful. And of course, if you want any help with this or you have any specific questions, check out the Naturally Thin for Life membership. We will leave a link in the outro of this episode as well as the show notes. And I would love to help you further in there. I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and I'll talk with you all next time. Hey friend, if you're enjoying the podcast, I invite you to come and check out the Naturally Thin for Life membership at naturallythinforlife.com/join, where you'll learn the full Naturally Thin method broken down into simple and doable steps so that you lose the weight you want peacefully and rapidly and keep it off with ease for the rest of your life. The Naturally Thin for Life membership provides you with the tools to not only lose the weight you want, but customize your mindset and your habits to your unique body and life. As part of the membership, you also get an implementation workbook to ensure your inevitable success. Head over to naturallythinforlife.com/join to get an inside look and tour of the Naturally Thin for Life membership. Hear from countless women who've utilized the tools and the extraordinary successes they've been able to achieve. I hope you join us over there at naturallythinforlife.com/join.